Well, we've all been gifted the worst advent calendar this year, with a tally of strikes announced by health workers, firefighters, teachers, lecturers, civil servants and transport, postal and security workers. Do you know what, Phil? It probably would have been easier for me to say who was still working, but never mind.
Exactly. Downing Street have urged unions to call off the industrial action over the festive season, but a lack of intervention may mean Britain is in for another winter of discontent. Here to discuss this is Trade Unionist and firefighter Paul Embery. Paul, thank you for joining us. I mean, how much of this strike action is actually industrial and how much of it is political?
Well, I don't think any of it is political in a true sense. I mean, the idea that millions of workers have suddenly woken up one morning and thought, we're going to take industrial action because we want to bring down the Conservative government is obviously not true. I mean, what we're seeing is a result of circumstance, as a result of the economic landscape that is facing millions of workers at the moment, in terms of the cost of living crisis, in terms of people struggling to pay their energy bills, their mortgages, worried about buying their kids Christmas presents, etc. And people, I think, simply have reached the end of their tether. You know, they were told in 2008 that they had to pay the price for an economic crisis they didn't create, the global financial crisis. They're now being told again that they've got to pay that price in terms of real terms pay cuts. And there comes a point where workers simply say, actually, that's not a price I'm prepared to pay anymore. And if you insist that I do, I'm going to take action about it.
Yeah, I mean, look, everyone wants to be paid more. I'm not aware of anybody who doesn't want to be paid more. But, you know, there's lots of the average salary in the UK is about £28,000 a year. There's people going on strike here, train drivers. Average pay of a train driver, I was reading last night, is £57,067. Lots of people, nurses, lecturers, all have salaries, average salaries above the national average salary. Is it really justifiable? If, of course, they want to be paid more, and we understand that everybody wants to be paid more and that times are tough for everybody, but is it really fair for them to be asking for higher pay from taxpayers, most of whom are earning much less than them?
Well, I would rephrase the question. Is it fair that people should continue to suffer economic hardship? You know, we've had 14 years of sluggish economic growth and paltry pay increases. And is it fair that we're insisting that people continue to take real terms pay cuts at a time where they're struggling to make ends meet? And I have to say, Philip, the truth is that not everybody is struggling, actually. We've still got a fundamentally unfair economy in this country. There are people at the top who did very nicely throughout the pandemic. We see city bonuses surging, for example. We see executive pay rising quite handsomely. We see some of our corporations registering record profits. We've got a government that sees fit to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses. And workers can actually see this going on and think, well, hold on a second, I'm suffering a wage squeeze, which is actually the worst since Napoleonic times, and this simply isn't fair.
Yeah, but that's all very well, Paul. But, I mean, look at the railways as a prime example. You know, they've got some of the most outdated, ludicrous, idiotic working practices that is known to mankind. You've got 12-minute time allowances for a 60-second walk. You've got a policy where lunch has to be restarted. If a boss talks to you, even if he just comes across and says hello to you while you're having lunch, your lunch hour starts from scratch again. You can't roster an individual to do a one-person task. You've got to roster a whole team. It's like carry on at your convenience from the 1970s. And the government and the railways have said, look, if you deal with some of these restrictive and ridiculous, outdated working practices, you can have your pay rise. And yet the unions refuse to even accept them. So it seems to me that maybe the pay rise isn't actually that important if they're still clinging on to these ludicrous working practices.
Well, even if some of that stuff is true, and I'm quite sure the RMT has actually refuted some of those suggestions and have a completely different take on it, I don't really accept that kind of justifies any employer. And I don't think we necessarily need to focus just on the railways, because this industrial reaction that we're seeing is spread across many sectors. I don't think it's an argument to say, well, it's a reason for us to hold down your pay. The reality is, yes, of course, it's right and it's proper that trade unions should get into discussions on improving, modernising working practices and so on. But the idea that they should be blackmailed and told, well, even during a cost of living crisis, when inflation is running at 10, 11%, we're going to hold down your pay and only offer you, in my case as a firefighter, 5%, for example, that somehow is justified, I simply don't accept. I mean, I think people ultimately have got to realise this isn't just about
Paul,
so-called...
I'm going to come from a different tack here, and I want to also explain it's Paul Embery. I know just before we said Professor Carl Hennigan. He's on a bit later. This is Paul Embery. I just want to get that right. See, we do have a problem, and I think, you're now a professor. Look, we have a problem, and how we solve it, I guess it's going to be this. There is no more money, and we've all got to understand this. Where is the money coming from? And some people say, well, what you do is you squeeze the rich people even more because they should be paying more and they, whatever it is. But the reality is we've got to work out how this is going to work. So somebody like me who's on the train strike has been so bad for regular working people. They're not using the trains anymore. You're losing millions of pounds a day, so that's money that isn't going to go to the workers. They're now using cars. They're not going to go back on the railways. We are destroying industries because you think you're going to get more money. I was even looking at the health sector. 250,000 people paid for their surgery this year because of the delays. You've got private now, people taking sort of private insurance. What I'm saying is strike action is going to destroy your sectors rather than getting round a table and saying, what can we afford and how do we help people?
Well, people always say that. People who oppose unions always say that strike action doesn't work. And the reality is quite often it does work. And of course, it should never be a first resort. It should always be a last resort. But when, as in my case, in the fire and rescue service, for example, the union has engaged in months and months of negotiations, and the employers say, actually, this is all you're worth, this is all you're going to get, there is no more money on the table. And then at some point, you have to either just accept that and cave in, or you have to say, well, we're prepared to take industrial action over it. I mean, I don't accept, actually, that there isn't. I mean, at the top of the interview, I outlined some of the people who have done very nicely in recent years. For example, there's huge scope for a wealth tax in this country. We could apply a wealth tax which potentially raises billions to be able to fund our public services and give people a decent pay increase. I mean, there's a broader argument there. As a sovereign currency issuing country, there's no reason, frankly, why we should ever be short of money. And we saw that during the COVID crisis, for example, that suddenly we were able to find billions of pounds when it mattered. I don't see why we shouldn't be able to do that now to give people a decent pay increase.
Paul Embery, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and I do hope you will join us again because there's so much to talk about here. I looked at sort of the NA